Hi, I'm Lauren Hayes, and I thought family meant having people in your corner, supporting your dreams, celebrating your wins. Instead, at last month's charity gala at Grandview Country Club, my own parents stood in the marble foyer telling anyone who'd listen that their daughter was financially struggling, practically begging for handouts, living paycheck to paycheck despite her fancy business cards. They painted me as a fraud, a wannabe entrepreneur drowning in debt, while desperately trying to maintain appearances among Connecticut's elite. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know was that 3 months earlier I had quietly purchased the very country club they were standing in, the same place where they'd been members for 15 years. The same place where they thought they held all the social power. But the most shocking part wasn't their lies, or even my secret ownership. It was realizing that my own family had been sabotaging my reputation for months, all because they couldn't stand that I had built something they never could. The late September air in Millbrook carried that crisp promise of autumn, the kind that makes you want to wrap yourself in cashmere and sip wine by a fireplace. I pulled my silver BMW into the circular drive of Grandview Country Club, the gravel crunching beneath my tires in a rhythm that usually felt like coming home. Tonight, however, something felt different. The grand colonial clubhouse loomed against the darkening sky, its white columns and sprawling wraparound porch bathed in the warm glow of strategically placed spotlights. This place had been my sanctuary for years, a refuge from the chaos of running my tech consulting firm, a place where I could decompress after 16-hour days spent managing million-dollar client accounts. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the stone pathway, and smoothed down the navy blue cocktail dress I'd chosen specifically for tonight's monthly social mixer. The fabric was silk, expensive but not flashy, exactly the kind of understated elegance that played well with the Grandview crowd. As a member for the past 8 years, I'd learned to navigate the unspoken dress codes, the subtle hierarchies, the careful dance of Connecticut high society. What I hadn't learned, apparently, was how to recognize when my own family was orchestrating my social destruction. The heavy oak doors of the clubhouse opened into the familiar warmth of the main lobby, all mahogany paneling and Persian rugs, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across oil paintings of long-dead club founders. The cocktail hour was already in full swing, the gentle hum of conversation mixing with the soft piano music drifting from the bar area. I recognized most of the faces scattered throughout the space: fellow business owners, retired executives, the wives of prominent surgeons and lawyers who lunch here 3 times a week and know everyone's business before they do. I made my way toward the bar, nodding and smiling at familiar faces, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and weekend plans. Everything felt normal, comfortable even, until I spotted my parents near the fireplace. Richard Hayes stood with his usual perfect posture, silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light, navy blazer pressed to perfection. My mother Catherine was beside him, her blonde hair styled in that timeless bob she'd worn for 20 years, her pearls catching the light as she gestured animatedly to Claire Morrison, one of the club's most notorious gossip. I was about to approach them, when something in their body language stopped me. There was an intensity to their conversation, a conspiratorial lean that made my stomach clench with unease. Instead of walking over, I veered toward the bar, positioning myself where I could observe without being seen. What I witnessed in the next 10 minutes would change everything. "Lauren's really struggling these days," my mother was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that wealthy women perfect over decades of charity committees. "She's putting on a brave face, but the business isn't doing well at all. Richard and I are so worried about her." Claire Morrison leaned in closer, her eyes lighting up with the prospect of fresh gossip. "Really? But she always seems so put together, driving that nice car, wearing those designer clothes. All for show," my father interjected, shaking his head with practiced disappointment. "She's drowning in debt, borrowing money just to keep up appearances. We've tried to help, but she's too proud to admit she's failing. It breaks our hearts, really." My mother nodded sadly, dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. "She won't even let us pay for her membership here anymore, says she can handle it, but we know she's barely scraping by. We're terrified she's going to lose everything she's worked for." The words hit me like ice water. Every syllable was a lie, carefully constructed and delivered with Oscar-worthy performance. My business wasn't struggling, it was thriving. I had 12 full-time employees, a waiting list of potential clients, and enough money in my business accounts to buy and sell half the people in this room. More than that, I had recently made the biggest financial move of my life, one that would shock everyone in this building if they knew the truth. But here were my parents, the people who should have been my biggest supporters, systematically destroying my reputation with fiction. I watched as Claire Morrison nodded sympathetically, already calculating how quickly she could spread this juicy tidbit to her network of fellow socialites. By tomorrow morning, half of Millbrook's elite would believe I was a failed entrepreneur desperately clinging to relevance. I ordered a glass of wine with shaking hands, my mind racing to understand the motivation behind this betrayal. When had they decided I was the enemy? When had my success become something to undermine rather than celebrate? The answer came to me with startling clarity, as I remembered our last family dinner 2 months ago. We'd been sitting in their formal dining room, the one with the Waterford crystal and the china that only comes out for special occasions, except there hadn't been anything special about that particular Tuesday. My mother had been regaling us with stories from her book club, my father was halfway through his second scotch, and my younger brother Brandon was picking at his food while complaining about his latest unemployment stint. "So what's new with the business, Lauren?" my father had asked, more out of obligation than genuine interest. I'd made the mistake of being honest. "Actually, things are going incredibly well. We just landed the Morrison Industries account, and I'm looking at expanding into the Boston market. I'm even considering some investment opportunities." The temperature in the room had shifted immediately. My mother's smile became strained. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, and Brandon actually looked up from his phone for the first time all evening. "Investment opportunity," my mother had repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "That sounds risky, dear. Are you sure you're not overextending yourself?" "I'm being smart about it," I'd assured her. "My financial advisor thinks it's a good move, and I've got more than enough capital to make it work." That's when my father had set down his scotch glass with just a little too much force. "Must be nice," he'd muttered, "having so much money to throw around while your brother can't even find a decent job." The jealousy had been palpable, thick as the humidity that blankets Connecticut in August. It wasn't about concern for my welfare, or worry about my decisions. It was about the fact that their daughter, the one they'd always seen as the responsible but unremarkable middle child, had somehow built something bigger and more successful than anything they'd ever achieved. My father's construction company had been solid but small, providing a comfortable upper-middle-class lifestyle, but nothing spectacular. My mother's part-time work at the local museum was more hobby than career. And Brandon, well, Brandon had been living in their basement for 3 years, contributing nothing but dirty laundry and attitude, but I had built something real. Starting with nothing but a laptop and a head full of ideas fresh out of business school, I'd grown my tech consulting firm from a one-woman operation into a multi-million-dollar company. We specialized in helping traditional businesses modernize their technology infrastructure, and in today's digital world, that meant we were never short of clients. The work was challenging, the hours were long, but the financial rewards had exceeded my wildest dreams. More importantly, those rewards had recently allowed me to make a purchase that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. In June, when the ownership group behind Grandview Country Club had quietly put it up for sale, my investment advisor had brought me the opportunity. The club was profitable but needed capital for renovations and expansion. The asking price was substantial, but not beyond my reach. After weeks of due diligence, financial projections and legal reviews, I'd made an offer that was accepted within days. The transaction had been completed with absolute discretion, all the paperwork handled through corporate entities and law firms. As far as the membership knew, Grandview had simply changed hands to a new investment group. What they didn't know was that I was that investment group. Standing in the bar of the club I now owned, watching my parents systematically destroy my reputation, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. This wasn't just idle gossip or misguided concern. This was calculated sabotage, designed to diminish me in the eyes of people whose opinions mattered in this community. They wanted to cut me down to size, to make me small enough that their own mediocrity didn't look so glaring by comparison. I finished my wine and moved through the crowd, making polite conversation while my mind worked furiously. Every interaction felt different now, colored by the knowledge that these people might already be seeing me through the lens of my parents' lies. Miss Patterson from the tennis committee seemed a little distant. Mr. Chun from the golf pro shop looked at me with what might have been pity. How long had this been going on? How many conversations had my parents had like the one I'd just witnessed? As the evening progressed, I found myself studying the crowd with new eyes. These people weren't just fellow members anymore. They were my tenants, in a sense. Every monthly membership fee they paid was contributing to my investment return. Every dollar they spent on meals, drinks, and events was flowing into accounts that I ultimately controlled. The irony was almost laughable. Here my parents were, trying to convince everyone that I was financially desperate, when in reality I held more power in this building than anyone else in the room. The revelation should have felt triumphant, but instead it felt hollow. What good was financial success if the people who should have been proudest of me were actively working to tear me down? What was the point of achieving everything I'd dreamed of, if my own family saw it as a threat rather than a cause for celebration? I was pulled from my brooding by a familiar voice calling my name. Nicole Park appeared at my elbow, her warm smile a welcome relief from the tension that had been building in my chest all evening. Nicole had been my closest friend since college, one of the few people who knew me before the money, before the business success, before any of the complications that came with financial independence. "You look like someone just told you Christmas was canceled," she said, linking her arm through mine. "What's wrong?" I glanced around the room, making sure we were out of earshot before answering. "I just overheard my parents telling Claire Morrison that I'm broke and desperate." Nicole's eyebrows shot up. "What? That's insane. Your business is doing better than ever." "I know, but apparently they've decided that the best way to handle their discomfort with my success is to convince everyone I'm actually failing." Nicole paused, searching for the right word. "That's psychotic. Why would they do that?" "Because they can't stand that I've built something bigger than what they ever achieved," I said, the truth feeling bitter on my tongue. "Because Brandon is a 30-year-old failure living in their basement, and it's easier to tear me down than to deal with that reality." Nicole squeezed my arm sympathetically. "What are you going to do about it?" I looked around the room again, taking in the familiar faces, the elegant surroundings, the carefully maintained atmosphere of exclusive comfort. 3 months ago, this place had been just another country club, somewhere I enjoyed spending time but had no real connection to beyond my membership. Now it was mine, and that ownership gave me options I'd never had before. "I'm not sure yet," I told Nicole, "but they have no idea what they've just started." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful conversation. I found myself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs that my parents' poison had already taken root. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. People who usually engaged me in lengthy discussions about business or current events seemed to cut our conversations short. Others offered unprompted reassurances about economic downturns being temporary, clearly believing I was struggling financially. By the time I said my goodbyes and walked back to my car, I felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with the long day at the office. The drive home to my downtown condo usually helped me decompress, but tonight the familiar route felt like a journey through enemy territory. How many of the people I'd pass tonight would be talking about poor Lauren Hayes tomorrow? How many would be sharing my parents' fabricated version of my financial situation over coffee and croissant? My condo was a study in understated luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, custom kitchen with appliances I'd barely had time to use, artwork I'd collected over the years as my income allowed for such indulgence. It was beautiful, comfortable, and completely private. No one else's opinion mattered here. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the windows, looking out at the lights of the city below. The phone rang just as I was settling into my favorite chair with my laptop. Tyler Rodriguez's name appeared on the screen, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Tyler was my business partner in several investment ventures, but more than that, he'd become someone I could trust with the complicated realities of my life. "How was the country club drama tonight?" he asked without preamble. Tyler had a gift for cutting straight to the heart of things. "Worse than I expected," I admitted. "My parents are actively sabotaging my reputation. They're telling people I'm broke and desperate." "Jesus. Why?" "Because they can't handle the fact that I'm more successful than they are. Because it makes them look bad that their daughter has everything figured out while their son is a professional basement dweller." Tyler was quiet for a moment. "You know, there's a certain poetic justice in the fact that you own the place where they're spreading these lies." "I've been thinking about that," I said. "The question is what to do with that information." "What do you mean?" I took a sip of wine, considering my words carefully. "I mean, I have options now that I didn't have before. Power they don't know I possess." "Lauren," Tyler's voice carried a note of warning, "whatever you're thinking, make sure it's worth it. Family drama has a way of getting messier than business disputes." "They made it messy when they decided to lie about me to half of Millbrook's social elite," I replied. "I'm just thinking about how to clean it up." After I hung up with Tyler, I spent the next hour pacing around my condo, my mind racing with possibility. The smart thing, the mature thing would be to confront my parents directly, to have an honest conversation about their concerns and try to repair whatever had broken in our relationship. But the more I thought about their performance tonight, the more I realized that a private conversation wouldn't fix this. They hadn't just shared their concerns with family, they'd launched a public relations campaign designed to destroy my credibility. That required a different kind of response. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through the documents from the Grandview purchase. The acquisition had been structured to give me complete control while maintaining operational continuity. The existing management team stayed in place, the membership structure remained unchanged, and the day-to-day operations continued exactly as they had before, but ultimate authority rested with me, and that authority extended to membership decisions. It was nearly midnight when I found what I was looking for. Buried in the membership agreements that every club member had signed was a clause about conduct detrimental to the club's reputation. It was standard language, included in most private club contracts, designed to protect the organization from members whose behavior might reflect poorly on the institution. The clause was broad enough to cover everything from public intoxication to financial scandal to social misconduct. Spreading false information about fellow members certainly seemed to qualify. I closed the laptop and finished my wine, feeling a plan beginning to crystallize in my mind. My parents thought they held all the cards in this game. They'd been members of Grandview for 15 years. They knew everyone. They moved in the right social circles. They believed their word carried weight, that people would trust their version of events, simply because of who they were in this community. What they didn't understand was that the rules of the game had changed, the power dynamic had shifted in ways they couldn't imagine, and tomorrow I was going to begin showing them exactly what that meant. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the look on their faces when they'd been spreading their lies tonight. There had been something almost gleeful in their destruction of my reputation, a satisfaction that went beyond simple concern for my welfare. They'd enjoyed it, relished the opportunity to cut me down in front of people whose opinions mattered. That enjoyment was about to become very expensive. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that makes you want to stay in bed with coffee and a good book. But I had work to do, plans to set in motion, and a reputation to rebuild. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that projected competence and authority, checked my calendar to make sure my morning was clear, and drove to my office in the Riverside Business District. My company occupied the entire third floor of a converted warehouse building, all exposed brick and modern fixtures, the kind of space that said we were successful but not stuffy. My employees were already at their desks when I arrived, the comfortable hum of productivity that I'd worked years to create. This was what I'd built, what my parents were trying to convince people was failing. Every computer screen, every employee paycheck, every client contract represented hours of work, strategic decisions, and calculated risks that had paid off beyond my wildest expectations. I settled into my office and began making calls. The first was to Mr. Davidson, the club manager at Grandview. He'd been in his position for 8 years, long enough to understand the delicate social dynamics that made private clubs function, experienced enough to handle sensitive situations with discretion. Mr. Davidson, this is Lauren Hay. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to discuss a membership matter this afternoon. His voice was warm and professional. Of course, Miss Hayes. Would 2 o'clock work for you? Perfect. I'll see you then. The second call was to my attorney, Patricia Lawson, who had handled the Grandview acquisition and understood the legal implications of club ownership. I briefly outlined the situation with my parents and asked her to review the membership agreements for potential violation. It's definitely worth exploring, she said after I'd explained the previous night's event. False statements about a member's financial situation could constitute conduct detrimental to the club's reputation, especially if it's causing other members to question the integrity of the membership screening process. What would be the process for addressing something like that? The membership agreement outlines a formal complaint procedure, written notice, opportunity to respond, review by the board of directors, in extreme cases, suspension or termination of membership, and as the owner, you have significant influence over the process, though you'd want to be careful about the appearance of personal vendetta. Better to let the established procedures work and simply ensure they're followed properly. After hanging up with Patricia, I spent the morning diving into client work, using the familiar rhythms of strategic planning and problem solving to calm my racing thoughts. But by lunchtime, I knew what I had to do. My parents had forced this confrontation by choosing public humiliation over private conversation. Now they would discover that actions have consequences, even for people who've never had to face them before. At exactly 2 o'clock, I walked into Mr. Davidson's office at Grandview Country Club. The space was exactly what you'd expect from a traditional club manager's office: leather-bound books, hunting prints on the walls, a heavy wooden desk that had probably been there for decades. Miss Davidson rose to greet me, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair, and the kind of understated authority that comes from managing wealthy people's expectations for a living. Miss Hayes, please have a seat. How can I help you today? I settled into the chair across from his desk and chose my words carefully. I've become aware of a situation involving some of our members that may require the club's attention. Last night, I overheard Richard and Catherine Hayes making false statements about another member's financial situation to multiple people. They were claiming this member was struggling financially, borrowing money, and unable to maintain their lifestyle. Miss Davidson's expression became carefully neutral. That's certainly concerning. May I ask which member they were discussing? Me. His eyebrows rose slightly, but his professional composure never wavered. I see, and you're certain these statements were false? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a folder I'd prepared that morning. Completely false. I've brought documentation of my company's financial health, my personal assets, and my payment history here at the club. As you can see, I'm current on all my obligations, and have been for the entire 8 years of my membership. Mr. Davidson reviewed the documents carefully, his expression growing more serious as he absorbed the information. When he finished, he looked up at me with something approaching concern. Miss Hayes, this is quite troubling. If these statements are indeed false, and they're being made to other members, it could constitute a violation of our membership standards regarding conduct detrimental to the club. That was my understanding as well, I said carefully. I'm not looking for dramatic action, but I do think the club should be aware that this is happening. Other members might begin to question the integrity of our membership screening process if they believe financially unstable individuals are being allowed to maintain their status here. It was a calculated argument, and I could see Mr. Davidson processing the implications. Private clubs lived and died by their reputations for exclusivity and high standard. If word spread that Grandview was harboring members who couldn't afford their obligations, it would damage the institution's credibility. What outcome are you looking for? He asked. I'd like the club to follow its established procedures for addressing membership violation. I think a formal review of the situation is warranted, don't you? Mr. Davidson nodded slowly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'll need to discuss this with our board of directors. But yes, this seems to warrant a formal review. Would you be willing to submit a written complaint outlining the specifics of what you observed? Absolutely. When would you need that? By the end of the week would be sufficient. We'll schedule a board meeting to review the matter and determine appropriate next steps. As I left Mr. Davidson's office, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The wheels were now in motion, but there was no telling exactly where they would lead. What I did know was that my parents' campaign to destroy my reputation was about to encounter an obstacle they'd never seen coming. The rest of the week passed quietly. I focused on my work, avoided Grandview except for one brief lunch meeting, and carefully crafted the written complaint Miss Davidson had requested. The document was factual, professional, and devastating. I included direct quotes from what I'd overheard, names of witnesses who had been present, and a timeline showing how long this behavior had apparently been going on. On Friday afternoon, I submitted the complaint and settled in to wait for the next phase of what was becoming a very interesting game of chess. My parents had made their opening move when they decided to attack my reputation. Now it was my turn, and I had pieces on the board they didn't even know existed. The weekend brought unseasonably warm weather for October, and I spent Saturday morning on my condo's balcony, with coffee and the newspaper, trying to enjoy the temporary calm before the storm I'd set in motion. My phone rang just after 10, and I was surprised to see my mother's name on the caller ID. We hadn't spoken since the dinner where I'd made the mistake of sharing my business success. "Lauren, darling, how are you?" Catherine's voice carried that particular falseness that I was beginning to recognize as her default setting when talking to me. "I'm fine, Mom. What's up?" "Oh, nothing special. I was just thinking we should have lunch soon. Maybe at the club. It's been too long since we've had quality time together." The invitation was transparently calculated. After weeks of radio silence, she suddenly wanted to have lunch at the very place where she'd been spreading lies about me. I wondered if she'd heard whispers about the complaint, or if this was just coincidence. "That sounds lovely," I said, injecting just the right amount of enthusiasm into my voice. "How about next Wednesday? Around noon?" "Perfect. I'll make a reservation." "Oh, and Lauren, maybe don't mention to anyone that you're doing well financially. You know how people can be about money talk." The audacity of the request left me momentarily speechless. She was asking me to participate in my own character assassination, to play along with the fiction she'd created about my financial struggles. "Of course, Mom," I managed. "I'll be discreet." After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone in amazement. Even now, even after being caught in their lies, they were doubling down. The lunch invitation wasn't an olive branch, it was an attempt to control the narrative, to make sure I stayed silent while they continued their campaign. It was exactly the kind of arrogant miscalculation that was going to make their downfall so much more satisfying. Monday morning brought a call from Mr. Davidson, requesting a meeting that afternoon. When I arrived at his office, I found him looking unusually grave, the membership complaint folder open on his desk beside what appeared to be additional documentation. "Miss Hayes, thank you for coming in. I've reviewed your complaint with our board of directors, and I'm afraid the situation is more serious than we initially realized." He gestured to the papers on his desk. "After receiving your complaint, we conducted a discreet inquiry among other members who were present at the September mix. We've confirmed that at least 6 people overheard the statements made by Richard and Catherine Hayes about your financial situation. More concerning, we've discovered that this wasn't an isolated incident." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "We have reports of similar statements being made at 3 other club events over the past 2 months. Your parents appear to have been systematically spreading false information about your financial status to multiple members of this club." The scope of their campaign was even broader than I'd realized. This wasn't just jealousy or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a sustained effort to destroy my reputation within the Millbrook social community. "What are the board's recommendations?" I asked. Miss Davidson's expression was serious. "Given the extent and deliberate nature of these violations, the board is recommending immediate suspension of Richard and Catherine Hayes's membership, pending a formal hearing." If the allegations are substantiated at that hearing, we'll be moving forward with permanent termination of their membership. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Membership termination at Grandview wasn't just about losing access to tennis courts and formal dining. In a community like Millbrook, it was social death, a public declaration that you'd violated the fundamental codes of conduct that held the elite community together. When will they be notified? I asked. The suspension letters will be delivered today. The hearing is scheduled for next Friday afternoon. I nodded, processing the information. In less than a week, my parents would find themselves facing the consequences of their lies in the most public and humiliating way possible. The irony was perfect. They'd tried to destroy my reputation at the club, only to discover that their actions had destroyed their own standing instead. Is there anything else I need to do? I asked. Just be prepared to testify at the hearing if called upon. Though given the number of witnesses we've identified, your testimony may not be necessary. As I drove home from that meeting, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me was satisfied that justice was being served, that my parents were finally facing consequences for their actions. But another part of me felt genuinely sad about what was happening to our family. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to go. I'd never set out to destroy their social standing. I'd simply wanted them to stop trying to destroy mine. But they'd forced this confrontation by choosing lies over truth, public humiliation over private conversation. Now they were about to learn that in a world where reputation matters more than almost anything else, spreading false information comes with a price they couldn't afford to pay. Tuesday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that seeps through even the heaviest coats, and I found myself standing in my kitchen, staring at my phone as it buzzed with increasingly frantic calls from my parents. The suspension letters had been delivered that afternoon, just as Miss Davidson had promised, and the Hayes family was clearly in full panic mode. I let each call go to voicemail, not quite ready to engage with whatever desperate strategy they were concocting. The first voicemail was from my father, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Lauren, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this needs to stop immediately. Call me back." The second was from my mother, tears evident in her trembling words. "Sweetheart, there's been some terrible misunderstanding at the club. They've suspended our membership over some ridiculous complaint. We need to talk right away." By the fifth message, my brother Brandon had joined the campaign. "Hey sis, Mom and Dad are freaking out about some club drama. They think you might know something about it. Can you call them back? They're driving me crazy here." I poured myself a glass of wine and finally listened to the messages in order, fascinated by the evolution of their tone. The first few were demanding, almost aggressive, as if they truly believed they could bully their way out of the consequences. But as the evening progressed and I didn't respond, desperation began creeping in. They were starting to realize that this wasn't some minor misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with charm and social connections. My phone rang again just after 9 o'clock. This time it was Nicole and I answered immediately. "Please tell me you're watching the neighborhood Facebook group right now," she said without preamble. "I'm not. Should I be?" "Oh honey, you need to see this. Your mother just posted what might be the most unhinged social media meltdown in Millbrook history." I quickly pulled up the neighborhood group on my laptop, and there it was, posted just 20 minutes earlier. Catherine Hayes had written a sprawling, barely coherent rant about persecution and jealousy and ungrateful children who turn against their families. She'd tagged half the town in the post, including several Grandview members, essentially broadcasting her hysteria to anyone who would listen. "Sometimes you give everything to your children and they repay you by stabbing you in the back," the post began. "Some people can't stand to see their parents happy and successful, so they make up lies and stories to hurt innocent people. We've been wrongfully suspended from our club because someone who shall remain nameless decided to spread vicious rumors about us. This is what happens when you raise a child to believe they're better than everyone else. Shame on those who believe lies over truth. We know who our real friends are now." The comments section was already filling up with responses, and they weren't the supportive messages my mother had clearly been hoping for. Instead, people were asking pointed questions about what exactly had happened, expressing confusion about the vague accusations, and several former Grandview members were sharing their own stories about Richard and Catherine's behavior at club events. "This is incredible," Nicole said. "She's essentially confirming everything the club accused them of, just by posting this." "She's not thinking clearly," I replied, though part of me was impressed by the thoroughness of my mother's self-destruction. "Panic makes people do stupid things. Are you going to Absolutely not. She's doing a better job of destroying her credibility than I ever could." The next morning brought a new development that I hadn't anticipated. Tyler Rodriguez called just as I was getting ready for work, his voice carrying an excitement that immediately got my attention. "Lauren, you need to see the business section of the Hartford Courant today. There's an article about local entrepreneurs, and guess whose company got featured?" I quickly pulled up the newspaper's website and found the article Tyler was referring to. "Tech consultant builds $1 million empire from small-town roots," read the headline, accompanied by a professional photo of me, taken at a conference last year. The piece detailed my company's growth trajectory, our client list, and my recent expansion into the Boston market. It was exactly the kind of positive press that most business owners would kill for. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Here was independent, third-party validation of everything my parents had been claiming was false. The article included specific revenue figures, employee counts, and growth projections that painted a picture of a thriving, successful enterprise. Anyone who read it would immediately understand that the financial struggles my parents had been describing were pure fiction. "Did you have anything to do with this?" I asked Tyler. "I may have mentioned your company to a journalist friend when she was looking for local success stories," he admitted. "I figured it was time people knew what you'd actually accomplished." The article began generating immediate buzz on social media. My business phone started ringing with congratulatory calls from clients and colleagues. My LinkedIn profile was flooded with connection requests, and several potential investors reached out about future opportunities. But more importantly for the current situation, the article served as irrefutable proof that my parents' claims about my financial struggles were complete fabrication. By noon, screenshots of the article were being shared in the same neighborhood Facebook groups where my mother had posted her meltdown the night before. The contrast was stark and devastating. On one hand, a successful entrepreneur being celebrated for her achievements. On the other, parents claiming their daughter was struggling financially. The discrepancy was so obvious that even casual observers began questioning the Hayes family's credibility. I was reviewing client proposals when my assistant knocked on my office door. "Lauren, there's a woman here to see you, says she's your mother, but she doesn't have an appointment." My stomach tight. Catherine had never come to my office before, never shown any interest in seeing the business I'd built. Her appearance now could only mean one thing. She was desperate enough to try a face-to-face confrontation. "Send her in," I said, closing my laptop and preparing for what was undoubtedly going to be an unpleasant conversation. Catherine entered my office looking like a woman who hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she clutched her designer handbag. She looked around the space with obvious surprise, taking in the modern furniture, the wall of awards and recognition plaques, the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking downtown Millbrook. "This is larger than I expected," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "What can I do for you, Mom? You know why I'm here." Her voice carried a tremor that suggested she was barely holding herself together. "This club situation has gotten completely out of hand. People are talking, spreading gossip, making us look like terrible people." "Are you terrible people?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, more direct than I'd intended. Catherine's face crumpled slightly. "How can you even ask that? We're your parents. We love you. Everything we've ever done has been for your benefit, including telling everyone at Grandview that I'm broke and desperate." She had the grace to look ashamed, at least briefly. "We were worried about you. Sometimes when people have money, they make poor decisions. We thought if people knew you were struggling, they might be more understanding if things went badly." The explanation was so absurd that I almost laughed. "You thought you were protecting me by destroying my reputation." "We never meant for it to go this far," she said, tears starting to form in her eyes. We just wanted people to know that success isn't everything, that family is more important than money. Except I wasn't struggling, Mom. My business is thriving, I'm financially secure. Everything you told people was a lie, but how were we supposed to know that? The tears were flowing freely now. You never tell us anything about your business, you keep everything to yourself. We had to guess what was happening in your life. It was a masterful deflection, turning their lies into my fault for not sharing enough information. But it revealed something important about their mindset. They genuinely believed they were entitled to know every detail of my financial situation, and my privacy was somehow a justification for their public character assassination. Mom, even if I had been struggling financially, spreading that information around Grandview would have made things worse, not better. You understand that, right? She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. We just wanted to help. Maybe if people knew you were having problems, someone would offer you opportunities or assistance, or maybe they'd stop doing business with me, because they'd think I was unreliable. I countered. Maybe they'd question my ability to manage their accounts if I couldn't manage my own finance. Catherine fell silent, apparently realizing for the first time that her help could have destroyed my career. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before she spoke again. What do we need to do to fix this? She asked quietly. I'm not sure it can be fixed. The club has suspended your membership. There's going to be a hearing on Friday where they'll decide whether to make the suspension permanent. But you could talk to them, she said, leaning forward eagerly. You could explain that this was all a misunderstanding. You have influence there. People respect you. The irony was almost too perfect. Here was my mother asking me to use the very reputation she'd tried to destroy in order to save her from the consequences of trying to destroy it. The influence she wanted me to leverage existed precisely because I'd built a successful business. The same success she'd been telling people was fictional. Why would I do that? I asked. The question seemed to genuinely confuse her. Because we're family. Because that's what families do for each other, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like what this family does is tear each other down out of jealousy and spite. That's not fair, she protested. We've always supported you. When have you ever supported me? The words came out with more emotion than I'd intended. When I was building this company, working 18-hour days, you complained that I never had time for family dinners. When I started making real money, you acted like it was somehow shameful or suspicious. And now that I'm successful, you're trying to convince everyone that I'm actually failing. That's not support, Mom. That's sabotage. Catherine sat in stunned silence, apparently hearing her own behavior described so bluntly for the first time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. We were proud of you. We just didn't know how to show it. You could have started by not lying about me to our entire social circle. She nodded miserably, seeming to understand for the first time the full scope of what she'd done. But understanding and accountability are different things, and I could see her already starting to formulate excuses and justifications. Lauren, please, your father is beside himself. Brandon keeps asking what's happening, and we don't know what to tell him. This membership means everything to your father. It's where he plays golf, where we have dinner with friends, where we celebrate anniversaries and birthdays. If we lose it, we lose our entire social life. Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to spread lies about me. We can make this right, she said desperately. We'll apologize to everyone, explain that we misunderstood your situation. We'll tell them how successful you really are. So now you want to tell the truth because it serves your purposes. Please don't punish us for making a mistake. I studied my mother's face, searching for genuine remorse or understanding of the harm she'd caused. What I saw instead was panic about losing social status, fear of public embarrassment, and frustration that her actions had consequences she hadn't anticipated. There was no real accountability, no recognition that she'd deliberately tried to damage my reputation for months. I'm not punishing you, Mom. I'm letting you face the natural consequences of your action. You violated the club's standards of conduct by spreading false information about a fellow member. Now you have to deal with the results. But you could help us, she insisted. You could convince them that we didn't mean any harm. Even if I wanted to help you, which I'm not sure I do. The decision is out of my hands now. The club has its procedures for handling these situations, and they're going to follow them. Catherine left my office looking defeated, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a reality she was only beginning to comprehend. I watched her walk slowly to her car through my window, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This wasn't how I'd wanted our relationship to evolve, but they'd forced this confrontation with their lies and manipulation. The rest of the week passed in a strange calm, like the eye of a hurricane, where everything appears peaceful even though you know the worst is yet to come. I threw myself into work, using client meetings and strategic planning sessions to avoid thinking too much about Friday's hearing. But by Thursday evening, I knew I needed to prepare for what was likely to be a dramatic conclusion to this family crisis.
Tyler took me to dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown, the kind of intimate space where we could talk without being overheard by curious neighbors or social media busybodies. Over wine and pasta, I filled him in on my mother's office visit and the growing panic in the Hayes household. "Do you think they'll actually show up to the hearing?" he asked. "They have to. It's their only chance to contest the suspension. Though honestly, I'm not sure what they could possibly say in their defense. The club has multiple witnesses to their lies. Are you having any second thoughts about letting this play out?" I considered the question carefully. Part of me feels guilty about how devastating this is going to be for them. But then I remember that they chose this path when they decided to destroy my reputation for their own psychological comfort. What happens after Friday? I don't know. If their membership is terminated, they'll be persona non grata in most of Millbrook's social circles. That's going to be hard for people who've defined themselves by their country club connections for 15 years. In your relationship with them, I honestly don't know if we'll have one after this. Tyler reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling this with more grace than they deserve." Friday arrived gray and rainy, the kind of weather that feels like an omen of unpleasant things to come. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected authority without appearing aggressive, understanding that my appearance at the hearing would be scrutinized by everyone present. Though I wasn't required to attend, Miss Davidson had suggested that my presence might be helpful if questions arose about the complaint process. The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in Grandview's formal conference room, a space typically reserved for board meetings and other serious club business. When I arrived, I found my parents already seated at one end of the long mahogany table, flanked by what appeared to be their attorney. Richard looked stiff and uncomfortable in his best suit, while Catherine appeared to have been crying recently. Brandon sat behind them, probably dragged along for moral support, but looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The club's board of directors filed in precisely at 2 o'clock, 5 distinguished members of Millbrook's elite, who took their responsibilities seriously. Miss Davidson sat at the head of the table with a thick folder of documentation, his expression professionally neutral but unmistakably grave. "This hearing is called to order," he began. "We're here to review the complaint filed against Richard and Catherine Hayes regarding conduct detrimental to the club's reputation, specifically the spreading of false information about fellow member Lauren Hayes." He outlined the complaint methodically, reading directly from my written statement and the corroborating witness accounts that had been collected during the club's investigation. The evidence was damning. 6 different members had overheard my parents making false claims about my financial situation on at least 4 separate occasions over 2 months. When Mr. Davidson finished presenting the evidence, he turned to my parents' attorney. "Miss Sterling, would your clients like to respond to these allegations?" James Sterling was a local lawyer known for handling wealthy families' legal problems with discretion and skill. But even his considerable talents couldn't overcome the weight of evidence against his clients. "Thank you, Miss Davidson. My clients acknowledge that they made statements about Miss Hayes's financial situation that have proven to be inaccurate. However, they maintain that these statements were made out of genuine concern for their daughter's welfare, not with any malicious intent to damage her reputation or the club's standing. It was a reasonable defense strategy, acknowledging the facts while arguing for mitigation based on intent. But I could see from the board members' expressions that the distinction between malicious lies and well-intentioned lies wasn't particularly compelling to them. Furthermore, Sterling continued, My clients were unaware of the true scope of Hayes's business success as she had not shared detailed financial information with her family. They made assumptions based on incomplete information, which they now deeply regret. Richard stood up suddenly, ignoring his lawyer's restraining. "We were trying to protect her," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "When you have money, people take advantage of you. We thought if people believed she was struggling, they'd be more genuine in their relationships with her." It was perhaps the worst possible thing he could have said. The board members exchanged glances that clearly conveyed their disbelief at such a transparent rationalization. One of them, an elderly woman named Margaret Whitfield who'd been on the board for 12 years, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Miss Hayes, are you suggesting that you deliberately spread false information about your daughter's finances in order to test the authenticity of her friendship?" Richard faltered, realizing too late that his explanation made his actions sound even more calculated and manipulative than simple jealousy would have. We were concerned about her judgment. Success can change people. So you decided to change how people perceived her success by lying about it. We weren't lying. We were protecting. The hearing continued for another hour, with Sterling attempting damage control while my parents alternately tried to justify their actions and minimize their impact. They produced character references from longtime friends, emphasized their 15 years of exemplary membership, and repeatedly stressed their love for their daughter and their regret about the misunderstanding. But the facts remained unchanged. They had systematically spread false information about a fellow member's financial situation to multiple people over an extended period. The club's standards were clear, and the evidence was overwhelming. When the board retired to deliberate, I found myself alone in the corridor with my family for the first time since this crisis began. The silence was heavy and uncomfortable, filled with everything we weren't saying to each other. "I hope you're satisfied," Richard finally said, his voice bitter. "You've destroyed your own family over your precious reputation." "I filed a complaint about members violating club standards," I replied calmly. "The board is making their own decision based on the evidence." "You could have talked to us privately," Catherine added, her eyes still red from crying. "We could have worked this out as a family. When you were telling Claire Morrison that I was broke, when you were convincing the Hendersons that I was borrowing money to pay my bill. When exactly should I have approached you about the lies you were spreading behind my back?" Brandon looked up from his phone for the first time. "This is so screwed up. You're really going to let them kick Mom and Dad out of their club?" "I'm going to let the board follow their procedures and make their decision based on the facts." "But you could influence that decision," he pressed. "You could ask them to be lenient." "Why would I do that?" "Because they're our parents," he said, as if the answer should be obvious. "And I'm their daughter." That didn't stop them from trying to destroy my reputation. The board returned 20 minutes later with their verdict. Mr. Davidson's expression was somber as he called the hearing back to order. "After careful consideration of all the evidence and testimony presented today, the board has reached a unanimous decision. The allegations against Richard and Catherine Hayes have been substantiated beyond any reasonable doubt. The spreading of false information about a fellow member's financial situation constitutes a serious violation of our standards regarding conduct detrimental to the club's reputation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "Therefore, the board hereby terminates the membership of Richard and Catherine Hayes, effective immediately. This decision is final and not subject to appeal." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest as if she'd been physically struck. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of red, his jaw working soundlessly as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. Brandon stared at the board members in shock, apparently unable to believe that his parents were actually facing real consequences for their actions. "You will have 30 days to settle any outstanding obligations to the club," Mr. Davidson continued. "Your access to all club facilities is terminated as of this moment. Club security will escort you from the premise." It was a complete and devastating victory, more thorough than I'd even hoped for. My parents hadn't just been suspended or reprimanded. They'd been permanently expelled from the social institution that had defined their identity for 15 years. In Millbrook's tight-knit elite community, this was social death. As security politely but firmly escorted my family toward the exit, My father turned back to look at me one last time. The expression on his face was a mixture of rage, disbelief, and something that might have been betrayal. In his mind, I was the one who had destroyed the family, the ungrateful daughter who had chosen outsiders over blood. But I knew the truth. They had destroyed themselves the moment they decided that tearing me down was easier than celebrating my success. They had chosen lies over truth, public humiliation over private conversation, and now they were facing the inevitable consequences of those choices. As I walked through Grandview's elegant corridors toward the exit, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of family and loyalty. For years, I'd believed that blood relationships came with unconditional obligations, that family members deserved forgiveness and support regardless of their behavior. But watching my parents lie about me to protect their own egos had taught me a different lesson. Respect and loyalty must be earned, even from family members. The autumn air outside felt crisp and clean, washing away the tension and drama of the past few hours. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, watching my parents drive away in their aging Mercedes, probably for the last time they'd ever set foot on Grandview's grounds. There was sadness in that realization, but also a profound sense of relief. For the first time in months, I didn't have to worry about what lies were being spread about me, what damage was being done to my reputation behind my back, or what fresh humiliation was being planned by the people who should have been my biggest supporter. The board's decision had vindicated me completely, but more than that, it had sent a clear message to anyone else who might consider similar tactics. Actions have consequences, even for people who've never had to face them before. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook, I found myself thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. There would be awkward encounters at community events, whispered conversations at charity functions, and the inevitable questions from people who knew both me and my former parent. But there would also be the satisfaction of knowing that truth had prevailed over fiction, that justice had been served, and that I'd finally learned to value my own peace of mind over family dysfunction. The real victory wasn't my parents' expulsion from Grandview Country Club. The real victory was my discovery that I didn't need their approval, their support, or their presence in my life to be happy and successful. I had built something meaningful and valuable entirely through my own efforts, and no amount of family drama could diminish that achievement. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole as I pulled into my building's parking garage. Saw your parents leaving the club looking like they'd been hit by a truck. I'm guessing the hearing didn't go well for them. I smiled as I typed back my response. Justice was, I'll fill you in over dinner. Your treat? Since you're apparently not broke after all. My treat, I confirmed, laughing for the first time in weeks. The elevator ride to my condo felt different somehow, lighter and more hopeful than it had in months. I was finally free from the weight of family expectations and obligations that had never been reciprocated. More importantly, I was free to build the kind of life I actually wanted, surrounded by people who celebrated my success rather than resenting it. As I opened my door and stepped into the sanctuary of my own space, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a family crisis. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I got to define my own relationships and surround myself with people who actually deserved my time and energy. The Hayes family civil war was over, and for the first time in my adult life I had won. The weekend following the hearing passed in unexpected tranquility. I spent Saturday morning at the downtown farmers market, something I hadn't done in months, due to the stress of the family situation. Walking among the vendor stalls, selecting fresh produce and artisanal breads, I felt a lightness I'd almost forgotten existed. No one stared at me with pity or whispered about my supposed financial trouble. Instead, several people approached me to congratulate me on the newspaper article about my business success. Mrs. Chen, from the flower stand, handed me a beautiful bouquet of autumn mums. These are on the house, dear. I've been following your story and I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. Don't let anyone dim your light. Her kindness caught me off guard and I found myself blinking back unexpected tears. For so long I'd been bracing for judgment and suspicion from the community. Instead, I was receiving validation and support from people who barely knew me but recognized authenticity when they saw it. Sunday brought a different kind of surprise. Tyler arrived at my condo with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, along with a mischievous smile that immediately put me on alert. "I have something to show you," he said, pulling out his tablet as we settled on my couch with our breakfast. The screen displayed what appeared to be a real estate listing, but not just any property. It was a stunning waterfront estate about 30 minutes north of Millbrook, complete with private beach access, a guest house, and grounds that looked like something from a luxury magazine. "It's beautiful," I said, scrolling through the photos, "but why are you showing me this?" "Because it's been on the market for 8 months, the price just dropped significantly, and the seller is motivated to close quickly. More importantly, it's exactly the kind of property someone in your financial position should be considering." I studied the listing more carefully, noting the price and the extensive amenities. It was expensive, certainly, but well within my means given the success of my business and my various investments. More than that, it represented something I'd never really allowed myself to consider: the possibility of living exactly how I wanted, without worrying about what others might think or say. "Are you suggesting I buy a mansion to spite my parents?" I asked, half joking. "I'm suggesting you buy a home that reflects your actual circumstances, rather than hiding your success to make other people comfortable. Your parents spent months telling everyone you were struggling financially. Maybe it's time to show them what financial success actually looks like." The idea was simultaneously appealing and terrifying. I'd spent years downplaying my wealth, driving a nice but not ostentatious car, living in a beautiful but modestly sized condo, always careful not to appear too successful or too different from the people around me. It was a habit born from years of family dynamics where my achievements were treated as somehow threatening or inappropriate. "Think about it," Tyler continued. "You own a country club, you run a multi-million-dollar business, and you're living like someone who's afraid of their own success. What message does that send?" He was right, though I wasn't quite ready to admit it. The conversation stayed with me through the rest of the weekend, particularly as I walked through my condo and noticed how carefully neutral everything was. Beautiful, yes, but safe, unremarkable, designed not to offend or intimidate anyone who might visit. Monday morning brought me back to the familiar rhythms of work, client meetings, and strategic planning sessions. But even as I threw myself into business matters, I couldn't shake Tyler's words about living authentically. During my lunch break, I found myself driving north of Millbrook, supposedly to scout potential locations for a satellite office, but really to see the waterfront estate Tyler had shown me. The property was even more impressive in person. Set back from the road behind mature trees that provided complete privacy, the house commanded a stunning view of the lake, while maintaining an air of elegant discretion. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious, but it was unmistakably the home of someone who had achieved significant success. Standing in the circular driveway looking up at the graceful lines of the architecture, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the desire to claim space in the world that truly reflected who I'd become. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "Heard through the grapevine that your parents are house hunting. Apparently they're looking at places in Vermont, somewhere they can start fresh where nobody knows about the country club situation." The news didn't surprise me, though it did carry a note of finality that was both sad and relieving. Vermont represented a complete retreat from the life they'd built in Millbrook, an acknowledgement that their social standing here was beyond repair. Part of me felt guilty about the role my complaint had played in their exile, but a larger part recognized that they'd created this situation through their own choices. That evening, I called the real estate agent listed on the waterfront property. Sarah Mitchell was a seasoned professional who specialized in luxury properties, and she seemed genuinely excited about my interest in the estate. "It's a remarkable property," she said during our phone conversation. The previous owners were a retired couple who maintained it beautifully but rarely entertained. "It's perfect for someone who wants privacy and elegance without the maintenance headaches of a truly massive estate." We scheduled a private showing for Wednesday afternoon, and I spent the intervening time researching everything I could about the property, the neighborhood, and the local market conditions. By the time I met Sarah at the estate, I'd already run preliminary financial calculations and knew exactly what I could afford. The interior tour exceeded my expectations. The rooms were spacious but not cavernous, elegant but comfortable, with details that spoke to quality and craftsmanship without being showy. The master suite offered panoramic lake views, the kitchen was a chef's dream, and the home office was larger and better appointed than my current workspace downtown. The sellers are motivated, Sarah mentioned as we concluded the tour. They've already purchased their retirement home in Florida and would like to close as quickly as possible. What kind of timeline are we talking about? With the right offer, we could close within 30 days. Standing in the living room with its wall of windows overlooking the lake, I made a decision that surprised even me. I'd like to make an offer. Sarah's professional composure slipped slightly, revealing her excitement. Wonderful. Did you want to think about the terms, or shall we discuss them now? Now, I said firmly. I know what I want. The next few hours were a whirlwind of negotiations, financial documentation, and legal review. By the time I drove home that evening, I'd submitted an offer that was slightly below asking price but included a quick closing timeline and proof of funds that made it virtually guaranteed to be accepted. Tyler was waiting in my condo lobby when I arrived, clearly too impatient to wait for me to call with an update. Well, he asked, as soon as the elevator doors closed. I made an offer, and we should know by tomorrow morning if it's accepted. Tyler's grin was enormous. This is huge, Lauren. You're finally going to live like the successful businesswoman you actually are. That night, I lay awake thinking about what this house purchase represented. It wasn't just about having a beautiful place to live, though that was certainly appealing. It was about finally allowing my external circumstances to match my internal reality. For years I'd been hiding my success, minimizing my achievements, living small to make other people comfortable. The waterfront estate represented a rejection of that self-imposed limitation. The call came just after 8 the next morning. Sarah's voice was bright with excitement as she delivered the news I'd been hoping for. Congratulations, Lauren. Your offer has been accepted. The sellers were impressed with your financial qualifications and your flexibility on the closing timeline. We can schedule the inspection for early next week and plan to close in 3 weeks. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of controlled euphoria, managing client calls and reviewing project proposals, while internally processing the magnitude of what I'd just committed to. This wasn't just buying a house, it was making a statement about who I was and what I'd accomplished. The news of my house purchase began spreading through Millbrook's social networks almost immediately. By lunch, Nicole had called with breathless updates about the speculation and gossip already circulating. People are saying you bought the Morrison estate, she reported, the one with the private beach, and the guest house that looks like a small mansion by itself. People talk too much in this town. Are you kidding? This is the most exciting real estate news Millbrook has seen in years. Everyone's trying to figure out how you can afford a $3 million house if you're supposedly struggling financially like your parents claimed. The irony was perfect. My parents' lies about my financial struggles had created exactly the kind of dramatic contrast they'd hoped to avoid. Instead of people seeing me as someone trying to live beyond my means, they were recognizing the obvious truth that my parents had been completely wrong about my circumstances. Over the next 2 weeks, as the house purchase moved through inspections and legal reviews, I found myself the subject of increased attention throughout Millbrook. People who had never shown much interest in my business suddenly wanted to know about my expansion plans, my client base, and my investment strategy. The newspaper article about local entrepreneurs had been impressive, but buying the Morrison estate was concrete proof of success that couldn't be dismissed or downplayed. The most interesting reaction came from members of Grandview Country Club. Even though my parents were no longer part of that community, word of my house purchase had reached the membership, and several people approached me with a new level of respect and curiosity. Margaret Whitfield, the board member who had questioned my father so effectively during the hearing, invited me for lunch at the club the week before my closing. We sat in the elegant dining room where my parents had spread their lies, but the atmosphere now was completely different. I have to admit, Lauren, I'm curious about something, Margaret said over our salads. During the hearing, your parents seemed genuinely convinced that you were struggling financially. Were they really that disconnected from your actual circumstance? It was a diplomatic way of asking whether my parents were delusional or simply lying, and I appreciated Margaret's directness. They were disconnected by choice, I replied carefully. I've always been private about my business success, partly because I didn't want to create family tension. Unfortunately, they interpreted my discretion as evidence of failure, rather than success, and the Morrison estate purchase, I decided it was time to stop hiding my accomplishments to make other people comfortable.
Margaret nodded approvingly. Good for you. Success should be celebrated, not concealed. The conversation stayed with me as I prepared for the house closing. Margaret's comment about celebrating success rather than concealing it felt like permission I'd been waiting for my entire adult life. For years, I'd been dimming my own light to avoid overshadowing family members who couldn't tolerate my achievements. The waterfront estate represented a rejection of that limiting mindset. The closing took place on a crisp October morning that felt full of possibilities. Sarah met me at the title company office with a thick folder of documents and the enthusiasm that matched my own excitement. The process was surprisingly straightforward for such a significant transaction, mostly involving signing my name dozens of times while lawyers explained details I'd already reviewed extensively. When the final document was signed and the keys were placed in my hands, I felt a sense of completion that went far beyond real estate ownership. This house represented everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, and everything I'd refused to apologize for despite family pressure to minimize my success. Tyler insisted on being the first person to see the house in my possession, and we drove out there together that afternoon with a bottle of champagne and takeout dinner from my favorite restaurant. Walking through the rooms as the actual owner felt completely different from touring it as a potential buyer. This was mine now, every elegant detail and beautiful view, earned through years of hard work and smart decisions. So what's the first thing you're going to do as lady of the manor? Tyler asked as we stood on the deck overlooking the lake. I'm going to host a housewarming party, I said, surprising myself with the decisiveness of the answer. A big one. Everyone who supported me through this family drama, everyone who believed in me when others didn't. I want to celebrate what we built together, including people from Grandview. Especially people from Grandview. I want them to see exactly what my parents were lying about. Tyler raised his champagne glass in a toast to Lauren Hayes, new lady of the manor and owner of the most spectacular vindication in Millbrook history. As we clinked glasses and watched the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink, I realized that this moment represented more than just personal success. It was proof that truth eventually surfaces, that hard work pays off, and that sometimes the best response to lies and manipulation is simply living your authentic life with confidence and grace. The planning for the housewarming party became an elaborate affair that consumed most of my free time over the next 2 weeks. I hired a catering company known for their work at high-end charity events, arranged for a string quartet to provide background music, and carefully curated a guest list that included business associates, Grandview members, longtime friends, and community leaders who had supported me during the family crisis. Nicole appointed herself my unofficial party planning consultant, helping me select everything from floral arrangements to menu options. Her excitement about the event was almost as high as my own, partly because she understood the symbolic importance of what I was doing. This isn't just a housewarming party, she observed as we reviewed catering proposals. This is a coming-out party for the real Lauren Hayes, the one who's been hiding behind modesty and family obligations for too long. She was absolutely right. For years I'd been apologizing for my success, downplaying my achievements, and living smaller than my circumstances warranted. The waterfront estate and the party to celebrate it represented a fundamental shift in how I presented myself to the world. The invitations went out 10 days before the event. Elegant cardstock that featured a photograph of the lake view and simple text announcing a housewarming celebration. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly everyone invited accepted, including several people who added personal notes, expressing their excitement about seeing my new home. Margaret Whitfield's response was particularly meaningful. "Dear Lauren," she'd written in her careful script, "I'm delighted to celebrate your new home and the success that made it possible. It's wonderful to see a young woman claiming the space she's earned." 3 days before the party, I received an unexpected phone call that initially filled me with dread. Brandon's name appeared on my caller ID, the first contact I'd had with any family member since the hearing at Grandview. "Hey Lauren." His voice was unusually tentative. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "It's fine, Brandon. What's going on?" "I heard about the house, the one you bought out by the lake." Word traveled fast in Millbrook,
so I wasn't surprised that news of my purchase had reached my family, despite their efforts to distance themselves from local social circles. Yes, I bought a house. It's really expensive, isn't it? Like mansion expensive. It's a nice house, I said carefully, not sure where this conversation was heading. Brandon was quiet for a moment before continuing. Mom and Dad have been saying that you must have gotten a loan or something, that there's no way you could afford a place like that on your own. Even now, even after everything that had happened, my parents were still trying to explain away my success rather than acknowledging it. The persistence of their denial was almost impressive in its stubbornness. Brandon, I paid cash for the house. I didn't need a loan. Another long pause. Cash? Like actual cash? Like actual cash? Holy shit, Lauren, how much money do you have? It was such a blunt question that I almost laughed. Enough to buy the house I wanted and still have plenty left over. But Mom and Dad said your business was struggling, that you were barely getting by. Mom and Dad were wrong about a lot of things. That's why they're no longer members at Grandview. Brandon processed this information slowly. So when they were telling everyone you were broke, you were actually rich. I was successful. There's a difference between being rich and being successful. But yes, they were completely wrong about my financial situation. This is so messed up, he said quietly. I actually felt sorry for you. They believed it too, I think. At least at first. But when the evidence started contradicting their story, they doubled down instead of admitting they were wrong. Are you still mad at them? It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with myself. I'm disappointed in them. I'm hurt by their choices. But mostly I'm relieved that I don't have to pretend to be less successful than I am just to make them comfortable. Would you ever want to see them again, like if they apologized and admitted they were wrong? I considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated, involving hurt feelings, damaged trust, and fundamental disagreements about family loyalty that couldn't be easily resolved. I don't know, Brandon. Maybe someday, but they would need to acknowledge what they did and why it was wrong, not just apologize because the consequences turned out badly for them. They're really struggling with the Vermont thing. Dad hates the idea of starting over somewhere new. And Mom cries about losing all her friends here. Those were their choices to make. I didn't force them to lie about me, and I didn't force them to double down when they got caught. After I hung up with Brandon, I found myself thinking about the conversation for the rest of the evening. Part of me felt guilty about how completely my parents' lives had been disrupted by the consequences of their actions, but a larger part recognized that this outcome was the natural result of choices they'd made repeatedly over months of deliberate deception. The night before the housewarming party, I walked through every room of the house one final time, making sure everything was perfect for the next day's celebration. The catering team had set up serving stations in the dining room, and on the deck, the string quartet had tested their equipment in the living room, and floral arrangements added elegant touches throughout the main floor. Standing in the master bedroom, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off the lake, I felt a sense of peace and accomplishment that had nothing to do with material possession. This house represented the life I'd built through my own efforts, the success I'd achieved despite family obstacles, and the future I was creating on my own terms. The party itself exceeded even my optimistic expectations. Guests began arriving just after 6, and the steady stream of cars up my driveway continued for nearly an hour, the house filled with conversation, laughter, and the kind of warmth that comes from people genuinely happy to celebrate someone else's success. Margaret Whitfield arrived with her husband and immediately began praising the house's elegant details and stunning views. "This is exactly what success should look like," she told me as we stood on the deck watching the sunset. "Tasteful, impressive, and well-earned." Tyler spent the evening playing unofficial host, making sure everyone had drinks and food while sharing stories about my business acumen and investment wisdom with anyone who would listen. His pride in my achievements was obvious and touching, a stark contrast to the family resentment I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Nicole documented everything with her camera, creating a record of what she called the night Lauren finally stopped apologizing for being awesome. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself relaxing and enjoying the celebration in a way I hadn't expected. The most meaningful moment of the evening came when several Grandview members gathered around me in the living room and began sharing their own stories about family members who had struggled with others' success. It seemed that my situation wasn't as unique as I'd imagined. Many successful people had navigated similar challenges with relatives who couldn't celebrate their achievements. "The hardest part," said Tricia Chen, a successful surgeon whose own parents had questioned her career choices for years, "is accepting that some people will never be happy for you, even when they should be the most supportive. But the beautiful part," added Margaret Whitfield, "is discovering that the people who matter most will celebrate your success genuinely and without reservation." As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I realized that this party had accomplished something beyond just showing off my new house. It had connected me with a community of people who understood and appreciated what I'd built, who saw my success as something to be celebrated rather than minimized or explained away. The last guest left just after 10, and Tyler helped me clean up while we debriefed the evening's success. "That was perfect," he said as we loaded glasses into the dishwasher. "Everyone was genuinely impressed. Not just with the house but with you. You seemed more confident and relaxed than I've seen you in years. I felt more like myself tonight than I have in a long time," I admit, "like I finally stopped hiding from my own life." "So what's next for the new lady of the manor?" I looked around the house that was now truly mine, filled with memories of an evening celebrating everything I'd worked to achieve. "Next, I think I'm going to live exactly as successfully as I actually am, without apology or explanation." It was a simple statement, but it represented a fundamental shift in how I approached my life and relationships. No more hiding my achievements to protect others' feelings. No more apologizing for success that I'd earned through hard work and smart decisions. No more allowing family dysfunction to limit my personal growth or happiness. As Tyler gathered his things to leave, he paused at the front door with a smile. "You know, your parents probably heard about this party from half a dozen people by now. Probably think they're starting to realize how wrong they were about your financial situation." I considered the question while looking out at the moonlit lake, my lake now, surrounding my house, my refuge, my symbol of everything I'd accomplished despite their attempts to tear me down. "I think they're starting to realize that their lies didn't just hurt me," I said finally. "They hurt themselves most of all, and that's a lesson that no amount of money can undo." 3 weeks after the housewarming party, I woke to find my new reality settling into comfortable routine. The waterfront estate had transformed from a bold statement into simply home, and I found myself appreciating small moments I'd never noticed before. Morning coffee while watching mist rise from the lake, evening walks along my private beach, the profound quiet that comes with genuine privacy. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking over my shoulder or wondering what stories were being told about me behind my back. The business continued thriving beyond my most optimistic projection. Word of my success had spread far beyond Millbrook, and I was fielding calls from potential clients as far away as Boston and New York. The waterfront estate provided the perfect setting for client meetings that required discretion and sophistication, and several major deals had been sealed in my home office overlooking the lake. On a particularly crisp November morning, my assistant Elena buzzed through with news that would shift the trajectory of everything once again. "Lauren, there's a call from someone who says she represents a major investment firm in Manhattan. She won't give me details, but she says it's regarding acquisition opportunities and she needs to speak with you directly." Acquisition calls weren't unusual in my business, but something about the timing and the caller's insistence on secrecy suggested this was different from typical client inquiry. I accepted the call, settling back in my desk chair as I prepared for what I assumed would be another routine business conversation. "Ms. Hayes, this is Victoria Caldwell from Meridian Capital Partners in New York. I'm calling because we've been monitoring your company's performance metrics, and we'd like to discuss a potential opportunity that could be mutually beneficial." Victoria's voice carried the crisp confidence of someone accustomed to moving large amounts of money and making decisions that reshape entire industry. Meridian Capital Partners was a name I recognized immediately. They specialized in acquiring successful technology companies and scaling them into national or international operations. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the direction this conversation was heading. "We're interested in acquiring your consulting firm as part of our expansion into the Northeast market. Your client retention rates, revenue growth, and operational efficiency metrics are exactly what we look for in acquisition targets. The words hung in the air while I processed their implication. An acquisition offer from Meridian would likely be substantial, potentially life-changing money that would dwarf even my current success, but it would also mean giving up the company I'd built from nothing, the business that had become not just my livelihood but my identity. I'd need to know more specifics before I could consider any offer, I said carefully. Of course, we'd like to send a team to conduct due diligence and present a formal proposal. Are you available for meetings next week? After hanging up, I sat in my office staring out at the lake while my mind raced through the possibilities. Selling the company had never been part of my long-term plans, but an offer from Meridian suggested my business was worth significantly more than I'd realized. The timing felt almost cosmic, coming just as I'd finally begun living authentically and claiming the space I'd earned. I called Tyler immediately, knowing he'd want to analyze every angle of this unexpected development. Holy shit, Lauren. Meridian Capital. They don't even look at companies worth less than 50 million. 50 million? The number seemed surreal even though I'd known my company was valuable. Their typical acquisition range is 50 to 200 million, depending on growth potential and market position. If they're calling you, it means they think your company could be worth serious money. That evening, I drove into town for dinner with Nicole, needing her perspective on this sudden shift in my professional landscape. We met at Romano's, a quiet Italian restaurant where we could talk without being overheard by Millbrook's ever-present network of gossips and social observers. So let me understand this correctly, Nicole said over wine and breadsticks. A major investment firm wants to buy your company for potentially life-changing money, and you're not sure if you want to sell. It's complicated. This company isn't just a business to me, it's proof of what I could accomplish on my own. It's validation of every risk I took and every sacrifice I made, but it's also a piece of paper compared to what you could do with $50 or $100 million. She was right, though. The emotional attachment to my business ran deeper than simple financial calculation. Selling would mean severing the connection to the work that had defined my adult life, the accomplishment that had finally freed me from family expectations and limitations. What would you do with that kind of money? Nicole asked. I considered the question while watching other diners enjoy their quiet conversations. I don't know. I never imagined having that much wealth, the house, the country club ownership, the current business success, that already feels like more than I dreamed possible. Maybe that's exactly why you should consider it. You've already proven everything you needed to prove. Now you could have the freedom to do anything you want without worrying about practical limitations. The meetings with Meridian Capital took place the following Tuesday at my waterfront estate. Victoria Caldwell arrived with a team of 3 analysts and a financial advisor, all carrying leather portfolios and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from handling enormous transactions routinely. The due diligence process was more thorough than I'd anticipated. They examined 5 years of financial records, interviewed key employees, analyzed client contracts, and reviewed every aspect of my business operations with microscopic attention to detail. By the end of the day, they'd dissected my company more completely than I'd ever done myself. Your metrics are even more impressive than our preliminary research suggested, Victoria told me as her team packed up their material. Your client retention rate is extraordinary, your revenue per employee is among the highest we've seen in this sector, and your growth trajectory suggests significant untapped potential. What kind of offer are we discussing? I asked direct. We're prepared to offer $85 million for full acquisition, with a 3-year consulting contract that would compensate you an additional $15 million for overseeing the transition and expansion phases. $100 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like discussing the distance to distant stars rather than actual money that could be deposited in bank accounts and spent on real things. I'd known my business was successful, but this offer suggested I'd built something far more valuable than I'd ever imagined. I'll need time to consider this, I said, though part of me wondered what there was to consider. This was more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes. Of course, take all the time you need, though I should mention that we're hoping to close this acquisition before the end of the fiscal year. Tax implications make December timing advantageous for both parties. After they left, I walked down to my private beach and sat on the dock, watching the late afternoon sun create patterns of light on the water. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, my parents had been telling everyone I was financially struggling, desperately trying to maintain appearances while my business crumbled. Now I was contemplating a business sale that would make me one of the wealthiest people in Connecticut. Tyler arrived an hour later with Chinese takeout and a bottle of expensive champagne, clearly prepared to celebrate what he assumed would be an easy decision. 85 million plus 15 for consulting, he said, shaking his head in amazement. Lauren, this is generational wealth. This is never worry about money again territory. I know what it is, but you're hesitating. I picked at my low man while trying to articulate the complex emotions swirling through my mind. This company has been my entire identity for almost a decade. Selling it feels like selling a piece of myself, or it feels like cashing in on everything you've built so you can start the next chapter with unlimited resources. What if I don't want a next chapter? What if I like this chapter? Tyler set down his chopsticks and looked at me seriously. Lauren, 6 months ago you were hiding your success to avoid family drama. Now you have the opportunity to have so much success that you'll never need to hide from anything again. You could buy and sell your parents' entire social circle if you wanted to. The conversation continued long into the evening, with Tyler making increasingly elaborate arguments about the freedom that true wealth could provide. But something inside me resisted the idea of letting go of the business I'd built, even for life-changing money. The next morning brought an unexpected call that would complicate my decision even further. Mr. Davidson from Grandview was on the line, his voice carrying a formality that suggested this wasn't a social conversation. Miss Hayes, I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. I wanted to discuss a matter that's recently come to the board's attention. Of course, what can I help you with? We've received some inquiries from other clubs in the region asking about our ownership structure. Apparently, word has spread that Grandview changed hands earlier this year, and there's curiosity about the new ownership group. I felt my stomach tighten. The discreet structure I'd used for the club purchase had been designed to maintain my privacy, but in small communities like Millbrook, secrets had a way of surfacing eventually. What kind of inquiries? Nothing official, just informal questions from board members at other clubs. But it's made us realize that we should probably be more transparent with our membership about the ownership transition. What are you suggesting? The board feels it would be appropriate to formally introduce you as the new owner at our next membership meeting. It would put an end to speculation and demonstrate the club's financial stability under your leadership. After hanging up, I realized that my anonymous ownership of Grandview was about to become public knowledge throughout Millbrook's social circle. The revelation would add another layer to an already complex situation, involving my family's exile and my rising prominence in the community. I spent the rest of the week wrestling with decisions that would fundamentally reshape my life. The Meridian acquisition offer represented financial security beyond imagination, but it also meant abandoning the business identity I'd spent years building. The prospect of being publicly revealed as Grandview's owner would complete my transformation from family disappointment to community power broker, but it would also eliminate any remaining possibility of reconciliation with my parents. Friday evening found me alone at the estate, sitting in my living room with legal documents spread across the coffee table. The acquisition papers were thick and complex, filled with terms and conditions that would govern the next phase of my life. But it was a much simpler document that captured my attention, a handwritten letter that had been delivered that afternoon. The envelope bore no return address, but I recognized my mother's careful script immediately. Inside was 3 pages of cream-colored stationery covered in her precise handwriting, the kind of formal correspondence she'd always used for important communications. My dear Lauren, the letter began. I know we haven't spoken since the terrible events at the club, and I know you have every right to be angry with us, but I hope you'll allow me this opportunity to say things that should have been said long ago. The letter continued with an admission that surprised me with its honesty. Catherine acknowledged that she and my father had been threatened by my success, that they'd felt diminished by my achievements rather than proud of them. She wrote about the difficulty of watching their daughter surpass them professionally and financially while their son struggled to find direction in his life. We convinced ourselves that we were protecting you from the dangers of wealth and success, she wrote. But the truth is that we were protecting ourselves from the discomfort of feeling overshadowed by our own child. We created a story about your struggles because it was easier than admitting that you had succeeded where we had failed. The letter went on to describe their current situation in Vermont, the isolation and regret that had accompanied their retreat from Millbrook. She wrote about missing the life they'd built in Connecticut, but also about beginning to understand the price of the lies they'd told and the damage they'd caused. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter concluded. "We made choices that hurt you deeply, and we compounded those mistakes by refusing to acknowledge them when confronted with the truth. But I wanted you to know that we finally understand what we did, and we're truly sorry for the pain we caused. Your success is something to be celebrated, not diminished, and we should have been your biggest supporters rather than your harshest critics. I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to give us another chance, though I know we haven't earned it." I read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of complexity in my mother's words. This wasn't the manipulative non-apology I'd expected, but a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and its consequences. Yet, even as I felt a stirring of sympathy for their situation, I recognized that words on paper couldn't undo months of deliberate lies and public humiliation. The weekend brought another surprise that would influence my pending decision. Nicole arrived Saturday morning with news that she'd learned from her network of contacts throughout the region. "There's a rumor going around that someone bought Grandview Country Club earlier this year," she said without preamble. "People are speculating about who has that kind of money and why they'd want to own a country club." "What kind of speculation?" "The usual suspect: tech billionaires looking for trophy properties, old money families making strategic investments, foreign investors interested in American real estate. But here's the interesting part. Several people have mentioned your name as a possibility." My anonymity as Grandview's owner was clearly eroding faster than I'd anticipated. The combination of my visible business success, the waterfront estate purchase, and the dramatic fallout with my parents had created a pattern that observant people were beginning to connect. "How long before it becomes common knowledge?" I asked. "Days. Maybe weeks. Once the speculation starts, someone always finds a way to confirm the details." That afternoon, I called Victoria Caldwell at Meridian Capital to discuss the acquisition timeline. If my ownership of Grandview was about to become public, I wanted to understand how that might affect the business sale negotiations. "Actually, that could work in our favor," Victoria said when I explained the situation. "Owning a prestigious country club demonstrates exactly the kind of business acumen and strategic thinking we value in acquisition targets. It shows you understand markets beyond just technology consulting. So it wouldn't complicate the acquisition. Not at all. If anything, it reinforces our confidence in your business judgment. Someone who can successfully acquire and manage a country club while building a tech consulting firm clearly has the kind of diversified expertise we're looking for." Monday morning brought the call I'd been expecting from Mr. Davidson, confirming that my ownership of Grandview would be announced at the next membership meeting. "We've scheduled the announcement for this Thursday evening," he said. "We'll introduce you as the new owner and outline your vision for the club's future development." "What kind of vision should I be prepared to discuss?" "Nothing too specific. Just general comments about maintaining the club's traditions while exploring opportunities for enhancement and growth." The prospect of standing before Grandview's membership as their owner felt simultaneously exciting and terrifying. These were people who had known me as a fellow member for years, who had witnessed my family's lies and my parents' subsequent expulsion. Now they would learn that I'd been the club's owner throughout that entire drama, adding layers of irony to an already complex situation. Tuesday evening found me in my home office, drafting remarks for the membership meeting, while simultaneously reviewing the final terms of the Meridian acquisition offer. The juxtaposition felt symbolic of the crossroads where I found myself, emerging as a public figure in Millbrook's elite community, while contemplating a business sale that would elevate me to an entirely different level of wealth and influence. Tyler joined me for dinner that night, helping me prepare for the membership announcement, while continuing his campaign for accepting the acquisition offer. "Think about it this way," he said over wine and pasta. "Owning Grandview makes you a big fish in Millbrook's small pond, but $100 million makes you a player on the national stage. You could own country clubs in multiple states if you wanted to. Maybe I don't want to be a player on the national stage. Maybe I like this pond. But wouldn't you rather like this pond while having enough money to buy and sell everyone in it? The question stayed with me through the rest of the evening and into the next day. Power and wealth were appealing in the abstract, but I'd already achieved more success than I'd ever imagined possible. The question was whether more money would enhance my life or simply complicate it with new pressures and expectations. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that would provide crucial perspective on my pending decisions. Brandon appeared at my front door looking nervous and uncertain, clearly struggling with whatever had brought him to my waterfront estate. "I know I should have called first," he said as I invited him inside, "but I was afraid you'd tell me not to come." "What's going on, Brandon?" "I wanted to see the house, and I wanted to talk to you about something important." I gave him a tour of the estate, watching his amazement at the elegance and scale of what I'd purchased. His reaction was honest and unguarded in a way that reminded me of the little brother I'd grown up with, before family dynamics had become complicated by success and jealousy. "This is incredible, Lauren. Like movie star incredible. I had no idea you had this kind of money." "Most people didn't. I've always been private about my financial situation. Maybe too private," he said as we settled on the deck overlooking the lake. "I've been thinking about what happened with Mom and Dad, and I realized something. They weren't just lying about your money. They were lying because they didn't know the truth, and instead of asking you directly, they made up stories that fit what they wanted to believe." It was a surprisingly mature observation from someone who'd never shown much interest in family psychology before. "You could have prevented all of this," he continued, "if you'd just been honest about how successful you were. They never would have created those lies in the first place." "So this is my fault for being private about my finances?" "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that maybe there's something to learn from this mess about the cost of secrecy, even when you think you're protecting people." Brandon's words echoed thoughts I'd been having about the acquisition offer and the club ownership revelation. My instinct had always been to downplay success and maintain privacy, but the recent events had shown me the price of hiding achievement. Maybe it was time to embrace transparency and let my success speak for itself. That evening, I made 2 phone calls that would determine the trajectory of my immediate future. The first was to Victoria Caldwell at Meridian Capital. "I've decided to accept your acquisition offer," I told her. "When can we schedule the signing?" "That's wonderful news, Lauren. We can have everything prepared for signature by early next week. Congratulations on making a very smart decision." The second call was to Tyler, who whooped with excitement when I shared the news. "This is huge. Do you realize what this means? You're going to be worth over $100 million by Christmas." "I realize it. I'm still processing it, but I realize it. We need to celebrate. Dinner tomorrow night after your club announcement. We'll toast to the new Lauren Hayes, media mogul and country club owner." Thursday evening arrived with an autumn thunderstorm that seemed appropriate for the dramatic revelation I was about to make. I drove to Grandview through sheets of rain, my remarks for the membership meeting folded in my jacket pocket along with my emotions about this final step in my transformation. The club's main dining room was packed with members eager to learn about their mysterious new owner. I recognized most of the faces, people who had known me for years as a fellow member but were about to discover that I'd been their landlord throughout our entire acquaintance. Mr. Davidson introduced me with appropriate ceremony, outlining the financial stability and growth potential that my ownership represented for the club. When he called me to the podium, the room fell into expectant silence. "Good evening, everyone," I began, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to shocked to impressed. "I know this revelation comes as a surprise to many of you. You've known me as Lauren Hayes, fellow member and local business owner. Tonight, you're learning that I'm also Lauren Hayes, your club's owner and hopefully your partner in ensuring Grandview's continued excellence." I spoke for 10 minutes about my vision for the club's future, my commitment to maintaining its traditions, while exploring opportunities for enhancement, and my pride in being part of such a distinguished community. But the real message was simpler. The woman they'd known was more successful and influential than anyone had realized, and she was finally ready to own that success publicly. The applause was enthusiastic and sustained, but it was the conversations afterward that truly mattered. Member after member approached me with congratulations, expressions of confidence in my leadership, and stories about how they'd suspected something significant was happening behind the scenes. Margaret Whitfield summed up the evening perfectly as I prepared to leave. "Lauren, this explains so much about your confidence during that awful business with your parents. You weren't just defending your reputation as a member, you were protecting the integrity of your own club." Driving home through the clearing storm, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in just 6 months. I'd gone from hiding my success to owning it publicly, from being the victim of family lies to being recognized as one of Millbrook's most influential residents. The business sale would add another layer to that transformation, elevating me to a level of wealth that would open doors I'd never imagined. But more than the money or the recognition, what mattered most was the freedom to live authentically. No more hiding achievements. No more apologizing for success. No more limiting myself to make others comfortable. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to be exactly as successful as I actually was. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the waterfront estate, and moonlight was beginning to break through the clouds, illuminating the lake in silver patterns that seemed to promise even brighter days ahead. Tomorrow would bring the final paperwork for the business sale, completing a journey that had begun with family lies and ended with financial freedom beyond imagination. As I walked through the house that had become my sanctuary and symbol of authentic success, I realized that the true victory wasn't the money or the recognition or even the vindication of my choices. The true victory was the discovery that I didn't need anyone else's approval or understanding to be successful and happy. I had everything I needed to build exactly the life I wanted, and for the first time ever I was finally free to enjoy it. 6 months later I stood in the same spot where this journey had begun, but everything had changed. The spring air at Grandview carried the scent of blooming magnolias and fresh possibilities, and I was no longer just a member seeking refuge from family drama. I was the owner, the decision-maker, the woman who had transformed a personal crisis into complete liberation. The acquisition of my consulting firm had closed in January, depositing $100 million into accounts I still couldn't quite believe belonged to me. The transition had been smoother than anticipated, with Meridian's team handling the expansion while I fulfilled my consulting obligations from the comfort of my waterfront estate. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning without the pressure of building something from nothing. The freedom was intoxicating. I'd spent February traveling, something I'd never allowed myself during the years of building my business. Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, each destination chosen purely for pleasure rather than client meetings or conference obligations. The trip had given me perspective on how small Millbrook's social dramas really were in the grand scheme of things, but it had also reinforced my appreciation for the community I'd fought to remain part of. March brought an unexpected phone call that would test my newfound peace. Brandon's name appeared on my caller ID on a Tuesday morning, and his voice carried excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Lauren, I have news, big news, good news, I hope. Mom and Dad want to come back to Connecticut. They're miserable in Vermont, and they want to try to rebuild their life here." My stomach tightened involuntarily. I'd grown comfortable with my parents' absence, with not having to navigate the complex emotions their presence triggered. Their return would force me to confront questions I'd been happily avoiding. "What does that mean, exactly?" "They want to meet with you, to apologize properly face to face, to see if there's any chance of repairing our family." I walked out onto my deck, looking across the lake that had become my refuge from exactly these kinds of complications. "Brandon, I got Mom's letter. I appreciated her honesty, but I'm not sure I'm ready for a face-to-face conversation. They've changed, Lauren, really changed." Vermont was like a wake-up call for them. They lost everything because of their pride and jealousy, and they finally understand what they threw away. "What do they want from me?" "Nothing. They don't want money or help getting back into social circle. They just want the chance to acknowledge what they did wrong and tell you they're proud of who you've become." After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day wrestling with emotions I thought I'd resolve. The rational part of me recognized that my parents had paid a steep price for their lies and manipulation. They'd lost their social standing, their community connections, and their relationship with their daughter. Justice had been served in the most complete way possible, but the part of me that remembered birthday parties and bedtime stories and family vacations before everything got complicated, wondered if redemption was possible for people who had genuinely learned from their mistakes. Tyler found me that evening sitting on my dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. He'd become my closest advisor and friend, the person who understood both my business success and the family complexities that had shaped my journey. "You're thinking about seeing them," he said, settling beside me with 2 glasses of wine. "How do you know?" "Because you have that look you get when you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't have a clear answer." I accepted the wine gratefully. Part of me wants to tell Brandon to forget it, that I'm happier without their drama in my life, but another part wonders if I'm being petty by refusing to hear them out. "What would it cost you to meet with them?" "Maybe nothing, maybe everything. I've worked hard to build a life where I don't have to apologize for my success or hide my achievements. Letting them back in could mean returning to those old dynamics, or it could mean showing them who you really are now, someone who's too secure to be threatened by their opinion." Tyler had a gift for cutting through emotional complexity to reach practical truth. The woman who had bought a country club and sold a business for $100 million wasn't the same person who had once hidden her success to avoid family jealousy. Maybe it was time to find out if that growth extended to forgiveness. 2 weeks later, I agreed to meet my parents at a small cafe in downtown Millbrook, neutral territory that would allow for easy escape if the conversation went bad. I arrived early, settling at a corner table where I could watch them enter, still uncertain about what I hoped to accomplish. They appeared precisely on time, but I barely recognized the people walking through the cafe door. Richard looked older, his perfect posture replaced by the slight stoop of someone who'd been humbled by circumstances beyond his control. Catherine's designer clothes had been replaced by simple understated outfits that suggested financial constraints. I'd never seen them face before. "Lauren," my mother said softly as they approached the table, "thank you for agreeing to see us." We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. Finally, my father cleared his throat and began speaking in a voice I'd never heard from him before. "We owe you an apology that goes far deeper than anything we could put in a letter," he said. "We were threatened by your success because it highlighted our own limitations. Instead of celebrating what you'd accomplished, we tried to diminish it to make ourselves feel better." Catherine nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "We convinced ourselves that we were protecting you from the dangers of wealth and success, but we were really protecting ourselves from feeling inadequate compared to our own daughter." "The lies we told weren't just wrong," Richard continued. "They were cruel. We tried to destroy your reputation because we couldn't handle the reality of your achievement." I listened to their words, searching for the manipulation and self-serving justifications I'd come to expect from them. Instead, I heard genuine remorse, and the kind of brutal self-awareness that only comes from losing everything you thought mattered. "What changed?" I asked. "Vermont," Catherine said simply. "Being cut off from everything we'd built here forced us to confront what we'd really lost. It wasn't just the country club or the social connections. It was you. We'd driven away the daughter we should have been proudest of." "We know we can't undo the damage we caused," Richard added, "but we wanted you to know that we finally understand what we threw away, and we're genuinely sorry." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering years of family dynamics, missed opportunities for understanding, and the price of pride and jealousy. They asked about my business sale, my plans for the future, and my life in the waterfront estate, but their questions felt genuinely interested rather than calculating or envious. When we finally prepared to leave, my mother reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "We know we don't deserve forgiveness," she said, "but we wanted you to know that we're proud of everything you've accomplished. You built something remarkable and we should have been your biggest supporters instead of your harshest critic." Driving home along the lake road, I felt emotionally drained but oddly hopeful. The parents I'd met today weren't the same people who had spread lies about me at Grandview. They were smaller, humbler, genuinely remorseful people who had learned expensive lessons about the cost of jealousy and pride. Over the following weeks, we began rebuilding our relationship slowly and carefully. They moved back to Millbrook into a modest rental house, a far cry from the elegant home they'd lost, but a fresh start that matched their new understanding of what really mattered. They made no request for financial help or social rehabilitation, seemingly content with the opportunity to repair their relationship with their children. The transformation in our family dynamics was remarkable. For the first time in years, My parents asked genuine questions about my business ventures, celebrated my achievements without resentment, and treated my success as something to be proud of rather than threatened by. Brandon flourished under this new family energy, finally finding direction in a job at a local nonprofit where his natural empathy could make a difference. Spring gave way to summer, and I found myself settling into rhythms that felt sustainable and fulfilling. The consulting work with Meridian provided intellectual challenge without the crushing pressure of building something from scratch. The country club thrived under management that understood both tradition and innovation. The waterfront estate became not just a symbol of success, but a genuine home where I could entertain friends, host business meetings, and simply enjoy the peace I'd worked so hard to achieve. The most significant change was internal. I no longer felt the need to justify my success or apologize for my achievements. When business magazines wanted to interview me about the acquisition, I accepted. When community organizations asked me to serve on boards, I chose the ones that mattered to me. When people asked about my wealth or my lifestyle, I answered honestly without embarrassment or false modesty. On a particularly beautiful evening in late June, Grandview hosted its annual summer gala, and I found myself standing in the same spot where my parents had once spread lies about my financial struggle. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now the host rather than just another guest, the owner rather than someone fighting for respectability. Tyler approached me during the cocktail hour, resplendent in his tuxedo, and clearly enjoying the elegance of the evening. "Penny for your thoughts, Madame Owner. I was just thinking about how different this night is from the last time I attended a Grandview social event. Then I was discovering that my own parents were trying to destroy my reputation. Tonight I'm celebrating with people who actually appreciate what I've built." Any regrets about how everything played out? I considered the question while watching the sunset paint the sky behind the clubhouse in brilliant oranges and purple. The journey from family scapegoat to financial independence had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Every challenge had forced me to grow stronger, more confident, more willing to claim the space I deserved. "No regrets," I said finally. "Everything that happened led me to this moment, this life, this understanding of who I really am. I wouldn't change any of it. Even the part where your parents tried to destroy you, especially that part. It forced me to stop hiding and start living authentically. Without their lies, I might have continued playing small forever." As the evening progressed and guests mingled throughout the club I owned, I realized that the real victory wasn't the money or the recognition, or even the vindication of my choice. The real victory was the discovery that I didn't need anyone else's approval to be successful and happy. I had everything I needed to build exactly the life I wanted, and I was finally free to enjoy it, without apology or explanation. Later that night, as I stood on my deck watching moonlight dance across the lake, I thought about the girl who had once believed that family meant unconditional support and loyalty. She'd learned that blood relationships come with no guarantees, that respect must be earned even from relatives, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable destructive behavior. But she'd also learned that forgiveness is possible when people genuinely change, that success is sweetest when shared with people who celebrate rather than resent it, and that authenticity is worth more than any amount of money or social approval. My phone buzzed with a text from Nicole. "Saw the photos from tonight's gala. You looked absolutely radiant. So proud of everything you've accomplished." I smiled as I typed back my response. "Thank you. For the first time in my life I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The lake stretched out before me, peaceful and infinite, under the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, new possibilities for growth and contribution, but tonight I was simply grateful for the journey that had brought me home to myself. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies can give you is forcing you to become stronger than you ever imagined possible. My family had tried to make me small, but they'd accidentally taught me to claim my full power instead. And that lesson, more than any amount of money, was worth everything I'd been through to learn it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.